Hey, everybody, and welcome to another episode of This Week in Global Development. I'm Raj Kumar. I'm the president and editor in chief in Devex. And here we've got a special episode for you. It's sponsored by Special Olympics. Everybody listening to this knows Special Olympics. It's the world's largest grassroots intellectual disability sports organization. It's an inspirational organization, and the numbers are kind of astounding. More than 4 million athletes and partners, 1 million coaches and volunteers. They work all over the world, and they're very much engaged in the development and humanitarian world, which is why we're so thrilled to bring a conversation to all of you today with Special Olympics' own Jackie Jodl. Great to be with you, Jackie.
Thank you. It's nice to be here with you, Raj.
And you are, of course, the Chief of Global Youth and Education at Special Olympics International. So you're thinking about education strategy and programming, and essentially how do you use the latest advances and techniques for social inclusion and opportunities for young people with intellectual disabilities all around the world. You guys put out an annual letter. I read it with great interest this year because it's got some new things in it and probably some things that I assume are continued from the past. Maybe we could just start there. Like, for people who are not as tuned in to this issue set, what do they need to know about young people with intellectual disabilities, intellectual and developmental disabilities, IDD as it's called, and the state of affairs right now in 2025?
Well, let me back up a minute, and I'll just start with a quick. You did a beautiful job describing my role, and what I really focus on is what we call inclusive research, policy, and programming for those with IDD, which is short for intellectual and developmental disabilities. So let me talk a little bit first about our Unified Champion Schools, and then I'll jump right into our letter, our annual letter authored by our chairman. So Unified Champion Schools is really the flagship education program for Special Olympics, and it really starts with this fundamental belief. And so we at Special Olympics, we believe that if you teach kids, if you teach children and young people how to play together, they're going to be able to learn and thrive together. That is the foundation for all of the schools-based programming that we do around the world. And so what we're doing is we're taking what we do well in the playing field, and we're bringing it into the classroom in the schoolhouse. And for those of you that are, sports fans like myself, like, it's really super intuitive, but I got to tell you, it's backed up by lots and lots of literature. So we use sport and other activities like youth leadership, and we have this model that we call Unified, and we bring together kids with and without intellectual disabilities, essential to the model. And what happens is they learn through sport, they build friendships across difference. And what we find is, in our case, that difference is intellectual and developmental differences, right? But it starts to really melt into other types of differences in the school's community. And you start building more inclusive, socially inclusive communities. And so what you see is that, and what Unified Champion Schools tells us, is that sport or play, if it's done inclusively, it's such a critical tool for learning and development. You start building mindsets that are inclusive. You start building school communities that are inclusive, where students aren't just physically in the same building, which so often happens, but they're actually part of the social fabric of the community. And so the kicker of all of this, in any educator, and I think of myself as an educator and also a coach in the past life, but as any educator and coach knows, right? When you build a healthier learning environment, students learn more, learning improves, sport gets better, and in the case of our Unified Champion Schools, we start seeing increased graduation rates, reduced bullying, improved test scores, and better social emotional skills for all students of all abilities. So
Well,
this is kind of the foundation of the work that I do.
let me just say, first of all, if you don't count as an educator, I don't know who does, because, by the way, you have 3 graduate degrees, including a PhD in this stuff. So you know your stuff. But let's not just leave it at the fact that you know your stuff, because you said something interesting. You said people who play sports will get this.
Yeah.
But I can imagine there are people who push back on this idea, who would say, okay, what is it? Sports, it sounds like a really nice thing to do. Maybe it does unify the kids who have IDD and kids who don't. But what does that have to do with educational attainment? And shouldn't we just focus more on reading and writing and math? And what do you say as somebody who knows this education space so well and the research so well to kind of combat that idea, which you must hear?
Yeah, I hear it, I hear it all the time. Like, Jackie, you're an educator. What are you doing working for a sports organization? And my first response is, wait a second, let's define a couple of things. First of all, what's a learning setting? Yeah, classroom is a learning setting, but I don't know about you. My kids learned a lot from Minnesota. My kids learned a lot in the hockey rink, a lot on the hockey rink, or on the playing field. Kids learn a lot. And they learn skills. Let me be very specific, and I'll bring my research hat in here. They learn skills, social, emotional skills like teamwork, communication, the ability to put oneself back in honor of the team's goals. They start losing gracefully. I mean, that's what, all these skills. And what happens, discipline, right? Fitness, discipline. Yeah. What happens is these skills are directly translatable to skills that you need when you're learning math or when you're learning reading, or frankly, they are predictors. Predictors get really technical of educational attainment and workforce success. So that's the first piece that I say. The second piece is, how do you define a great education? And you teased me about my degrees. I'm a first generation college grad. And I've got five sisters, and across the six of us, we all have got a crazy number of degrees because we love to learn, and we see education as, it's not perfect, right? There's so many issues, we're going to talk about them today, but it's the best mechanism that we have for social and economic mobility. You're not going to come up with a better one. We're going to pick apart, we're going to pick apart the model today, the mechanism today, but you're not going to come up with a better one. So when I talk to folks about education as a mechanism for social and economic mobility, we have to understand that it's not just about reading, math, science, social studies. It's not just about that. We have to define learning holistically, which includes all of the social, emotional, life skills, as well as those academic skills. I like both. And what the evidence shows is you need both for life success.
I totally agree. And I think, we're going to talk about AI a little bit,
Yeah.
in a moment here. But if you think about where society is going, it's probably even more important now in 2025 than ever to bring those kind of social and emotional skills to whatever a future workplace looks like. And that's for kids with IDD and kids without, right? The whole idea of your unified champion school program is you're bringing everybody together, and everybody's learning. Everybody is
Learning.
advancing.
Yeah, everybody's advancing. And I'm excited to talk about AI because I love listening to these leaders of these AI companies, which have incredible math skills, and they're talking about, well, wait a second, some of these life skills are going to be more important down the line as AI starts to become more prevalent in our day-to-day lives.
Yeah, so before we get to AI, I want to go back to this letter because I thought it was pretty interesting where you're laying out kind of, I know it's written by Tim, the chairman, but it's like you're laying out what are the basic challenges people face. And the way it boiled down to, for me, it sounds like governments, including a lot of the governments we and our audience care a lot about, governments in the global south, they are saying the right things. They might have even set up policies that are in the right direction on inclusion. But when it comes down to it, they are not living up to those policies. The practices aren't there, which can include funding, but it's not just about funding.
Yeah.
And I actually got a chance to go to Sierra Leone, I don't know, what is it, maybe 2 years ago now, and I got to meet with their Minister of Education. They've got this radical inclusion program.
Yep.
David Senge, he's well known in this space. So I have a flavor for it, but I'd love to hear more from you. What is this gap that you're finding when it comes to governments between policy and practice?
Right. Well, let me first touch on the motivation of the letter, which is twofold. And as you know, the letter is from our chairman, Tim Shriver, who is an educator in his own right. I have to get that out there. And it's a report card on how well we're doing in terms of creating inclusion in education. And it was motivated by us first as a grassroots organization. We have a responsibility to advocate for our athletes. Our athletes are those with IDD, and to give voice to their concerns. So that's the first motivation. The second motivation is that we see this letter as a crucial tool for accountability for governments who really have ignored the issue of inclusion on average in general for so long, and they're falling short of their commitments under the frameworks that you hear about in the development community, CRPD, the Convention on the Rights of the Persons with Disabilities, and the United Nations SDG 4, which you hear, which is the Sustainable Development Goal 4, all about educational equity. And the reality is there's lots of talk, but there's not enough walk. There's not enough putting money behind and the resources behind what it's going to take for commitments to inclusion to be realized in schools and in classrooms. And to give you a couple of great data points, just 40% of countries, low and middle income countries, have education budgets for children with disabilities. And UNESCO had this really interesting stat. Only 16% of the countries broadly talk about inclusive education in their general education laws. So they may have the policies, but once you codify them in the laws, then you got to start to fund them. So the letter, we're a hopeful organization, and my chairman, Dr. Shriver, is a hopeful man. And that his inner light, spans across the entire organization. So we highlight the progress. We absolutely highlight the progress and celebrate the progress. But what I want to do today, we have to draw attention to the glacial pace of change. And glacial pace is the way I describe it.
Yeah, and maybe that's an opportunity to bring in AI here, because it is one of your kind of three areas that you talk about in the letter. And I was interested by it because it does feel like AI is going to potentially dramatically change the way education is approached. And you talk in the letter that there is big opportunity because of this, but there's also some real risk. And maybe you can unpack that a little bit for us. Like, a lot of people are talking about this in the broader space of education, but you're thinking specifically for kids with IDD. Like, what are the implications now of these new AI approaches to learning?
Right. Well, the AI is clearly one of the most important themes of the letter. That's the new headline, is AI. And what we see as an organization is that the rapid growth, presents amazing opportunities, but it also presents some challenges for children with IDD. So it's a cautionary tale. And what we see is that without deliberate action to really promote inclusive tech development, that this AI revolution could exacerbate inequities. And it could leave students with IDD 3% of the global population even further behind. And so what we're concerned about is that if you don't design for our population, you really miss an opportunity to support all students, because we know what's best for those with IDD. Really, these approaches are what's best for all students. And so we went out and did a survey and talked to our community, and although parents and educators absolutely see, the majority of them see that it's important for students with IDD to develop these skills, only 1/3 of the educators think that developers are even taking into account our population, the needs and the priorities of our population, students with IDD, into their development plans. And I think that this is something that, as an organization, that we need to shout from the rooftops, because this train's out of the station. Like, we're moving forward, right? Like, I don't know about you, I'm using AI every day. I make myself use it every day. That's how it started, and now I don't know what I would do without it. And so if we don't start thinking really intentionally about children with learning differences, we're going to make the inequities that exist in our education systems across the world even more damaging to our society. So that's one of Dr. Shriver's most important points in his letter.
And I'll tell you, when I first saw it, I kind of thought, well, isn't it the opposite? Like, maybe I'm just seeing the glass half full, but there's going to be so many more tools, and can't these tools make it easier for someone to find a new way to learn that might be more appropriate for them, that they might find easier to access information? Maybe they don't have access to a teacher all the time, but they could have access to a tool, 24 hours a day, and chat with that tool. And I guess the thing that maybe I was missing from my first reaction that I'd love you to talk a little bit more about is the idea that, yeah, those tools might actually help the way somebody learns, but it could lead to less of a human connection. And that ultimately, the kids we're talking about, your students and your athletes, a lot of what they benefit from in education is the human connection. It's exactly why you have these unified champion schools. Is that kind of what you're concerned with here? Is that you might have better education tools but worse outcomes because of the human side is missing?
That's part of what we're saying. The first part about what we're saying, and this comes from our teachers, is that they are really skeptical that companies are thinking about our population. Okay, and there is this incredible promise of all the tools, assistive technologies, AI technologies that can really start to close the learning gap and provide tools to those with learning differences. And it was very interesting in a recent conversation that I was in with the head of the Global Partnership for Education. She described a conversation with a CEO of one of the world's leading technology companies, and he was taken aback by her not skepticism, but concerns, like, we got to make sure here that we're thinking about the current inequities in the education system. I'm here to represent IDD, but there are lots of inequities. We can talk about gender, we can talk about, socioeconomic, poverty, we can talk about protracted crisis, humanitarian, we can talk about all the inequities in the system and make sure that we use AI, make sure that those AI tools are accessible to students in all of those settings. So that's the first piece. Second, from that, the human connection is really dear to my heart because I see it. Sport is ultimately the setting where humans come together and they work through conflict in the pursuit of this common goal. So that's definitely something that our teachers and our parents are thinking about, and everyone in the AI community, education community, is thinking about as well. We can't lose the human connection. I mean, certainly, we can talk about Jonathan Haidt and some of the work that's come out recently in the U.S. where they're requiring that cell phones, for example, are no longer allowed during the school day. We can talk about those. We can talk about the emerging research that demonstrates that technology is related to rising rates of mental health issues among youth. And so we need to keep thinking about those things. Human connection is absolutely essential. The connection between the teacher and the student is the most important connection in a child's learning.
Yeah, it's a great point. It gets back to what you were saying right at the start. It's like, how do you define what is a good education?
Yeah.
And if it's literally just like, take this test and score really well on it, maybe you can use AI tools and everybody can do a little bit better than they would have without those tools. But that's probably not the whole story. No. And as you say, even those tools might not even be designed for these populations to start. They might be designed for others. And so then you get the inequalities grow bigger faster. So it's an interesting perspective.
This is an interesting perspective. I'm all in. I'm all in. I just want to make sure that in my role, I'm giving voice to this issue, and that we pay attention as much to the downside risk as the upside potential. Right? I mean, any any person who's running a business or an enterprise, everybody knows you got to pay attention to the downside risk as well as the upside potential, and that's what we're trying to do as well.
Yeah, and it makes sense given kind of the third point of the letter, which was to say there's a lot of frameworks and conversation and policy around an inclusive approach to education within schools, but it doesn't actually play out in reality.
Yeah.
So you could see a very similar thing happening with AI tools, of everybody getting very excited that, hey, these are going to be a great equalizer. And then at the end of the day, they're really not. They're maybe even the opposite. So maybe you could talk a little bit more about that third
Yeah.
part of the letter. What does that really mean?
Yeah, so let me talk. What we see often is that, or what we're seeing as one of the themes, and Dr. Shriver addresses it in the letter, is that we need to, and this goes back to the teacher, we need to really make sure that we strengthen the capacity and the mentoring of our educators so that they understand what inclusion is. They understand what it looks like in their classrooms and in their schoolhouse, and they can use tools to foster it in the learning settings. It's what's so interesting to me is when I travel around the world, when you talk to youth, they all know what the definition of inclusion is. They all know. They know what it looks like. They all say the same thing. I don't care if I'm Senegal, if I was in Romania, if I was in Ethiopia. I mean, I've been all over the world talking to young people. They know what it looks like. And most importantly, Raj, they know what it feels like. They know what it feels like. And so when I then flip and I sit in environments where I'm with policymakers, and all of the NGOs and the multilats, what happens then is it gets a little bit more confusing. We're not so sure what inclusion looks like. So one of the most important things that we did at Special Olympics is we sat down with some experts in the field and we said, okay, let's put a framework around this. And we've been working with the Harvard Graduate School of Education for 2 years. we call it the Inclusive Mindsets and Behavior. Clearly defines what inclusion is in very simple terms. And then what it allows us to do, once you really define it, it allows us to teach it. Dignity, empathy, perspective taking, and what we call courageous action, which is the behavior piece. It's not enough to believe these things, to value humankind at all levels. It's not enough to have empathy and to be able to take the perspective of another, but you have to be able to stand up at times, even if it's uncomfortable when you see exclusionary practices, or to celebrate an inclusionary example. So we've developed this framework with Harvard. We're testing it in 4 different settings right now and infusing it into not only our education work, we're bringing it across the Special Olympics organization. And our plan is to bring this back to schools of education where teachers are trained, and to start to infuse it into how teachers are trained. So one really great example is I was in the UAE, Abu Dhabi. One of the most interesting case studies in inclusive education is in the UAE. They're ahead of the rest of the world in terms of what they're doing, and they're actually taking this framework in one of the colleges for one of the education colleges there that trains teachers, and they're bringing it in along with other frameworks that they have to start to train teachers. So our hope is that we're gonna move this beyond Special Olympics and start to infuse it in schools of education and other environments with other organizations, completely open sourced, because it's a game changer once you can start to really tell people, what does inclusion mean? It sounds kind of amorphous, but once you nail it down into a really clear framework and bring it into the curriculum of the school, then you've got a fighting chance to start to drive social inclusion.
So you said something interesting there that I think would pique the interest of our listeners, because at the outset I talked a little bit what is Special Olympics, and everybody knows you. But then you said, well, when I'm sitting with multilaterals, when I'm sitting with bilaterals with NGOs, you talk about some of the countries you're traveling to, meeting ministries of education. It's pretty clear Special Olympics does a lot more than the athletic events it's famous for. And you, as I understand, have become much more engaged in development implementation. And I guess I want to know more about that work. Why do you do it? What has it taught you as an organization? What are you seeing from exactly some of the kind of experiences you just described?
Yeah. Well, when we think of Special Olympics, immediately the thought is trust. Our trust ratings are, through the roof. One of the most trusted nonprofits in the world. But usually, what people think of is, our flagship events. They think of summer and winter World Games, and they think of sport and the hundreds of competitions that are going on in communities around the world every day. But what people don't realize, which is why it's so lovely to be here with you, is we are doing so much more. We're working with governments, we're working with international organizations, and what we're doing is we're operating as an implementing partner with our Unified Champion Schools program and other things in the global South, tough, and beyond, lots of different settings, and we're addressing disparities. Disparities not only in education, but we're also focused on health, and we're also, of course, focused on job attainment, workforce issues. And what this does is it uniquely positions Special Olympics to be a force, really a voice for systemic change. That's the end game here. Like, I'm driving pockets of wonderful things all around the world, but the end game is we're trying to drive systemic change so we can change the lives, the educational experience of as many students as possible across the world. And so if we bring it back to education for a moment, which is my job here, you can see that with our Unified Champion Schools programming, we're trying to drive systemic change. We're in 30,000 schools, we're in over 150 countries, we're reaching 1 million students. And with that, as proud as I am of that, it's just scratching the surface, especially when you start talking about being a catalyst for systemic change, which, as I said, is really the end goal. So we are doing so much across the world, and it's wonderful that everyone recognizes us as a sports organization. And it's going to be really, I think, as we continue to really build our influence around the world, I think that it's going to be people will be increasingly aware of all the other great things we're doing.
Yeah, I got to say, as I've gotten to know Special Olympics over the years, I've become more familiar with it and know some of its work that it's doing at the education ministry level and on development projects. What's interesting to me is you've got some tools not every education organization has. Because of your sports work, because of your brand, you can operate at the global level and really influence the debate.
Yes.
But then you're also at the grassroots level, kind of almost like a movement
Yes.
at the
Yeah.
grassroots level.
Yeah.
And that's an unusual combination. Not everybody can do those two things. And now you're also implementing projects. So that's, I think my guess is for a lot of people listening to this who thought they knew Special Olympics, maybe they're going to have a different sense of who you are now.
Right. It's such, what you're saying is such an important insight into our work. We are on the ground. We are a grassroots organization on the ground implementing programming. But then at the same time, we really have access to any ministry around the world to go in and speak to policymakers. And as a lover of sport, oh my goodness, like over the holiday break, I watched with my 3 boys, I watched Invictus, right? I mean, sport is such a game changer around the world. If you're with those government officials and the sports ministries, often sports ministries are more powerful, certainly, than any other ministries in an organization around the world. It's a little bit different in the U.S., where sport is very much outside of the government, but around the world, it is not only a unifying force, but it's a resource center. It's a resource center, and many sports ministries are increasingly working more closely with education ministries because they see the tremendous potential when they join forces.
So just as we start to wrap up a little bit, I want to think about what are some of what's sort of the world look like to Jackie Jodl, the world you want to see? And it seems like there's a few threads from the discussion. So one is governments just living up to their commitments. So if they have a policy around inclusion, that they actually fund that policy. You talked about how few countries have put it into legislation, even when they have policy, because they don't want to back it up with the money. So I guess closing that financial gap between the rhetoric and the real commitment is one important thing. It sounds like for AI, you're really looking at the AI companies to step up and and do something different, and to work with organizations like yours to develop with people living with disabilities in mind, including IDD, and to really think at that level. And then it sounds like you're also talking to schools themselves about this idea of like a segregated system, of not true inclusion, and trying to get to the root of that, including through training teachers. I mean, talk us through a little bit, like, what does that vision look like? What do you want to see people who are listening to this, who work in the international development system, who work in ministries, like, what does the world look like to you that we're trying to work toward?
Yeah. Well, you did a beautiful job summarizing the key themes of Dr. Shriver's letter. The first one, absolutely. We need financing to accelerate that pace of change. I opened up with this description of the pace of change as glacial, and really, really calling upon governments to keep their promises. It begins with the financing. The second thing that you mentioned is teachers, and part of that is related to resources, but to really start to work with teacher training around the world, and be using frameworks that really clearly define inclusion in ways that allows teachers to teach it to themselves, to their colleagues, and then also, of course, to students. The third thing, again, AI. We've talked a lot about that. I won't say much more except that we need to have a level of caution and awareness of the downside. And then the final point that you didn't mention that I do want to mention is the humanitarian crises that we're seeing around the world. We in the research world, we call these intentional populations, right? I'm just going to say these are some of the kids that are really the most marginalized in protracted crisis settings. We're doing a really interesting project with the Education Cannot Wait in Uganda, in refugee settings, and we're going to figure out how to adapt our programming in that setting so that we start to bring children, where most children with IDD in those settings, they're not even in school. You talked about segregated, integrated, they're not even in school. So we're going to figure out how to use sport at the community level in these refugee settings to bring children into the education system. So that's one of the other themes that you hear. And then the final point is that it really, I'm going to use a term from one of our we have an amazing research collaborative that works as part of our Global Center for Inclusion in Education that's based in Abu Dhabi, which was a gift from His Highness following our games in 2019. And those games not only, I think, were partially the impetus for one of the best inclusive education systems across the world, granted, a very wealthy country, but they're working with us to bring their best practices to low-income countries around the world. But one of our members of our research advisory there, she has this great language to describe how I feel about the pace of change, which is unapologetically impatient. And you hear that whenever you hear our CEO, Mary Davis, or our chairman, Tim Shriver, or any of us talk about the movement, as we call it, the movement that Special Olympics drives for athletes with IDD. You can't be patient given the current state. Like, enough is enough. I mean, patience is not a virtue when you're talking about kids with IDD being 50% more likely to be out of school. And when they are in school, these tragic rates of social exclusion and bullying. So that's where I think that the final call to action is in the letter, that we need to keep our promises. Tim had this really great description of, so we built this exclusionary infrastructure over many decades called segregated education, it's not, and I understand, and we all understand that it's going to take some time to dismantle it, right? But we can't take decades to dismantle it. I mean, the costs are so high. It's this notion of education, educational malpractice. I mean, we're losing kids, as every day passes. And so I think for me, that's one of the most important messages of the letter.
It really is, and I just my takeaway here, because I get to think about these kinds of questions across so many sectors, is like expectations really matter. You
Yes.
know, there was a time when people thought, well, why do you even worry about education for refugee kids or kids in a humanitarian setting? There are other higher priorities. Education is not a priority, and it took
Oh,
years for people to shift that thinking and to say, no, it's actually, and it's not even done yet. That expectation is not completely fulfilled yet, but at least now it's a much more sort of standard idea.
yes.
That kids in a refugee setting or humanitarian setting, they deserve
They
education.
deserve education. It's a human right.
It's a human right. And so once you change that mindset, then it starts to change the way lots of organizations and people and ministries work and what gets funded. And so I think what you're saying here, what Special Olympics is putting out there, that it's not just, every kid except kids with IDD. It's every kid
Every,
get,
yeah.
deserves an education. And once you change that, then I think it affects the way a lot of different organizations listening to this have to work, have to design their programs. And I think that has that cascading positive effect that we want to see, and that leads to the development progress we can be proud of when we look back and think of things that have worked.
One of the most interesting findings when we were doing some research for this letter came from a global expert who said that in the settings where we have made the most progress, the key stakeholders, we're talking about parents, families, teachers, educators, community leaders, they start with exactly what you're saying, the notion that what's good for children with special needs is what's good for all students. And it's just a fundamental framework from which to view this work that starts to open up to change attitudes and open up the possibility that you can create these systems of education that are inclusive but that benefit all students. The other thing that I just want to mention that you said was so important, expectations matter. But you know what matters even more? I mean, commitments matter. You have to keep your promises. You have to keep your promises. You can't just talk. You can't just talk, right? You've been around the world. This is your business talking to people around the world in development. And what do you see? You see, just lots of talk, and far, far less realization of that talk with the types of commitments in this case. We're arguing for financial commitment because they deliver the types of training and resources and materials and systems change that we need.
Yeah, I call it pledgeflation. Everybody makes a pledge, but then, do they really live up to
Yeah.
that pledge? And
Yes.
and that's why the work that you're doing is so important. And it's been so great to spend some time with you to learn a little bit more about Special Olympics. And I'm sure those who are interested in learning more ought to take a look at that letter and reach out to Special Olympics to find ways you can work together if you're working in this space. It is such an important issue area. We're going to keep focusing on it here at Devex. So thank you, Jackie. A real pleasure to talk to you.
Yeah.
Thanks. And thank you to Special Olympics for sponsoring this special episode of This Week in Global Development. We'll be back next week with our next episode. Thanks so much.